Hello, everyone. Today is March 6th. It's Tuesday. I'm recording this in the morning, trying to prepare for the rest of the week. Obviously, spring break coming up, and I'm excited about having a week off, and I'm sure you all are too. But before we get ready to relax, we do have one major topic to cover, and that is sex, gender, and sexuality. So obviously we've covered race for most of the class, and frankly, that one has a lot more um, historical significance considering some of the atrocities that have taken place. But that's not to in any way demean or take away from the severity of sexism and gender differences. So what I'd like to do in this discussion today is just focus on the Candace West and Don H. Zimmerman article, Doing Gender, which you can find here in the Week 8 folder. That you go to course materials here on the left, access the Week 8 folder here, and here is the article. So we're going to go over the article in this lecture, but before I do, I wanted to talk a little bit about the cultural analysis essay, and we're going to look at some passages that my students have written recently. So I can tell you for a fact that I've already started grading, and I should be finished grading um, the cultural analyses by today, by this evening. I've already graded about half of my online class. My face-to-face classes I already finished. So I'm just finishing up with maybe 15 or 16 of you that I have left. And so far, I'm actually very pleased with the quality of the essays. I think they're good. The writing is still weak in some places, but I think generally I saw a lot more improvement. Of the half that I've graded so far in my online class, and of all the essays I graded for my face-to-face classes, most, if not almost all, passed, and that's a huge um, improvement from the summer response essays. I'm still, however, noticing that lots of you have not submitted an essay. I'm not sure why that is or what's happening there, but we do have, obviously assignments that are due, and I don't want you to fall behind. So if you feel like you are falling behind, you need to talk to me and let me know, or you might have to consider dropping the course. So uh, I'd rather avoid that. So if you're having trouble, please contact me, okay? So for now, before we get into the Doing Gender article, I'm going to share with you just a small presentation that I prepared. These are uh, quotes that I took from the cultural analyses essays from my face-to-face class. I didn't have time to create this presentation in time for this integrity lecture, but I think it will still serve the same purpose. And the class is the exact same. It's the exact same class. The only difference is that it's face to face. And so what I did is I had my students read these. In fact, let me go back a little bit. I had my students read uh, these quotes anonymously. So I removed the names, of course, so that way we wouldn't invade anyone's privacy, and if they were embarrassed by what they wrote, nobody would know who wrote them. The only thing we know is who it was written by, whether it was a man or a woman. And we had a lot of fun during lecture yesterday, and I've it's unfortunate that I don't have a format for doing that online. So I'm going to try to do my best to sort of capture some of the main points from the discussion I had with my face-to-face class and share it with you all. And then we're going to go into a critical discussion or examination of the article. Okay. So I had a couple of quotes written by women. Most of the quotes by women really focused on this idea of like being a man means something to do or has something to do with providing for a family, being a protector in some cases, having to do tougher jobs in some cases. Other women in the class seem to think that having genitalia or male genitalia would somehow be discomforting. And the writing again in some cases was not so great. Um, Other people pointed out that aren't as easily judged by their outward appearance, their how they dress and are perceived by others. I even had some students claim that it's not important for for men to even be educated. It's actually just a matter of uh, working straight out of high school, and their families would not care. Some people, or some of my students, seem to think that their families just would not care if they had an education or not. The men, on the other hand, focused on uh, odd things, and I had some really odd quotes, some of which I'll share specifically. But we had some basic ones like some students believe that society says that to be a woman you can't cuss, you can't talk back, you have to always obey your husband and father. You're in charge of cooking and cleaning up. Now, it was unclear based on some of the way these sentences were written whether or not the student believed that themselves or whether they were just summarizing what they've been told to believe or what they've observed outwardly. Uh, and there was a lot of heated discussion, of course. I had, men who, stoically believed what was being said here, and I had women in my class who were very much offended by this. And it's interesting because no one's really right. And that was another key thing I had to tell my students for the cultural analysis essay is that when you write this stuff, it's not about being right. It's about trying to tell the truth. It's about telling your truth, and your truth might contradict or be contrary to what someone else's truth is. But that's okay. This is a culture. This is not something that can be like math, where it's absolute in most cases. Here, it's generally can change and varies from person to person. I did have some odd things. Some men clearly expressed that, or actually revealed that they really don't know how women's bodies work. I had some men who thought that women first change their bodies by having a period. Like, well, not necessarily. That varies from girl to girl. He seemed to think that all girls struggle with cramps and cravings. Well, cramps again makes sense if you have a period once a month, but cravings is usually just a pregnancy thing. Although there is this tendency, I wouldn't say if it's scientifically accurate, but there's this tendency to say that women have crave chocolate or sugars on their periods, but that's not necessarily true for all women. And then he also seems to think that a period is a means of cleansing the body, as if women are always dirty. So it was really strange to read some of these things. We had more women who believed that they needed to learn how to repair things, to provide for their family, and so on and so forth. But more importantly, on a bigger scale, they believed that they could now choose, if this woman became a man, she could now choose to have a family or not, and be a promiscuous person or not. It wouldn't matter either way because society would accept that because she is a man. And that's I think, more telling example of what her experience must be. Whether or not she has the ability to make that choice, or whether that choice is made for her, which means it takes agency away from her. It takes power away from her. I had some other interesting quotes from men, especially. It seemed like the male quotes, at least for me, of course, I'm a male, I'm being biased. So the ones written by men, I feel like are, I get to have a unique glimpse into the male mind since I have a male mind. But a lot of these I very much disagreed with. So I had one student who said, he was talking about relationships. He says, you can now be the sensitive one because as a guy, you are taught to not share your feelings. And I was like, okay, I see where he's coming from, and I've heard that too. I don't necessarily agree with that, but it must be really sad, actually, that if right now he's a guy and he can't be sensitive, or then it seems like he can't tap into emotion, he has to be robotic. So that's sad in itself, and that's worth addressing. But the second part is what bothered me. He says, you would not be having sex with people. Now, people would be having sex you instead. I think that would be the hard thing to get your head around. And this is, and so I did not doctor these quotes in any way. So I didn't edit them at all. The grammar and the writing, the commas, punctuation, all that are exactly as they were in the essays. But my guess is that he's saying something like, when men have sex, they have sex with someone. But when women have sex, it's that people are doing that to you. And I think he's talking here mostly about penetration. And it is really complicated here because he seems to treat sex as this like one-way street where one person has agency, one person has power in this circumstance, and the other person is just an object upon which that power is executed. And that's very scary. This is actually, as many of the women pointed out, very rape-y. This is like sort of the basis for rape culture. What's even stranger is that it seems like if he's talking about relationships, right? Relationships are technically a connection between two or more items, or two or more things, or in this case, two or more people. But if he's treating sex as this one-way thing, how else does he treat other relationships that are supposed to be two-way, but instead are just one? So this was very revealing psychologically about this particular man's male mind. How he views women as sexual objects, it seems, and more importantly, that he'd be resigned, if he became a woman, he would be resigned to become a sexual object too. And again, there were more interesting things. There were also some women who expressed opinions that many of the men disagreed with. For instance, here, one woman said, "Being too honest is not cared for as much when you are male. For example, confessions are less embarrassing. If you get rejected, you just get over it and move on. For some reason, self-esteem does not decrease one bit." And of course, many of the men have jumped immediately and said, like, no, dealing with rejection is horrifying. It's not something you get over easily. In fact, for some of us, it's soul crushing, and it takes a long time to get over it. Risking your heart at the expense of someone and just being crushed. And so a lot of the men were very quick to point out that someone who wrote this would have to be very cruel, right? Someone who perhaps enjoys rejecting men on a regular basis. And obviously we have no proof of that, but it certainly reveals sort of the mentality that men have and what mentality this particular woman had. Other sort of interesting, I think, comments from men. One person said, "I would be able to control guys to my advantage if he were a woman. Most of us guys are just doing whatever a girl asks them to just because they're a girl. So I would for sure use that and get things done. One flip of my hair and I'd have the answers to the homework I forgot to do the night before." Again, he is painting some girl, or he perhaps himself. He keeps using this a girl business. But he seems to treat women as, again, sexual creatures only, rather than being a holistic human. He treats them as sexual creatures who only use their sexuality for gain or for monetary reasons. And so, again, this also seems indicative of male culture, at least in this area, in this region. And again, we had more, I suppose, interesting quotes. Again, here's another one by a man. He says, "In some occasions, if the girl doesn't get what she wants, she starts to act spoiled and might even throw a little tantrum, depending if it's the time of the month. Compared to a guy, he'll just brush it off. Sometimes things throughout the relationship start getting complicated and toxic, or feeling just fade away. Usually when that happens, fights or arguments tend to break out. As some females would do, is try to fix things by complaining and trying to prove an irrelevant point." And actually several women in the class were very quick to point out this sounds like someone just got over or just went through a breakup. And this is a very emotionally charged passage, and perhaps ill-founded, and perhaps not really indicative of how this person really thinks. But it's still powerful enough that he was very quick to, aim for things like biological determinism, right? Blaming a period, which is, obviously biological or physiological, as a way of throwing tantrums and somehow disparaging or discrediting this woman. Even claiming that she's stupid by saying that she's proving an irrelevant point constantly. So it seems like, again, this person resorts, even in moments of hate and perhaps hurt, immediately lashes out and tries to demean this woman in particular. Although he's not very specific, he says the girl. So he is thinking about, I think, some or a particular person, but then later on brushes it off as all, right? Some females. And again, I even had quotes from students who where it was unclear what the sex was. Some of these sentences, it didn't seem like, I couldn't tell if there was a woman speaking about what it would be like to be a man, or if it was a man talking about what it would be like to be a woman. It was in some cases it was unclear, and it was really fun asking students what they suspected it would be. But there were a couple of key points that again, I want to highlight for you as right before we get into the reading from Weston Zimmerman. Uh, Clearly, students, at least in my face-to-face classes, and partly in some of the ones I've seen read online so far, there seems to be, of course, huge discrepancies between what women think it's like to be a man and what men think it's like to be a woman. And these discrepancies are informed by several things. One, they're informed by societal expectations, and even that's kind of a weird phrasing. What do we mean by society? Where do these expectations come from? How are we taught? Or do we experience these expectations regularly? For instance, one of the men in my class was very quick to point out that not all men have to know about cars, right? Not all men have to be protectors of the family. Not all men, have to act in this sort of stereotypical way. And when I asked that particular student, well, are you not protective of your family? Do you not do these things and so on? He said, no, I do. So it seemed, again, like he was very quick to point out, he wanted to make exceptions to these so-called stereotypes or rules, yet he fell into them. So, and then on vice versa, I had students who claimed they were exceptions to the rules, but when we asked or took a survey of the rest of the class, it seemed the majority did fall into that stereotype. So even though we want to constantly argue that we're not part of a stereotype, we separate ourselves from cultural norms or societal norms, we still fall into them more often than not. So that it begs the question, where does gender and sex come from? How do we come up with these constructions? What makes certain behaviors or expectations abnormal, and so on, and what does abnormality mean? And that's where I want to sort of lead into this article. Candace West and Don H. Zimmerman, who wrote this article called Doing Gender. Now, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend that you do. And really, the bulk of the paper is best summarized in the first 4 pages or so, pretty much up until right here, on 2 or 3 pages in. Of course, I expect you to continue reading and understand their argument, but the argument is already laid out for you. And this article was published, if I can remind you, in 1987. This was published in June 1987 in the second issue of the first volume of a journal called Gender and Society. And you should know that gender and sex had already been discussed for a long time. In fact, they point that out here, talking about the late 1960s and early 1970s when in particular these two started teaching. But of course, they reference articles from as early as the 1930s that first talks about sex. And it's important here that when we talk about sex, we're not talking about coitus. We're not talking about the physical act of intercourse. We are talking about biological properties. In fact, they're very quick to talk. They mentioned that in the 1960s and 1970s, they separated sex and gender into 2 different categories. They said, one, sex is ascribed by biology, right? When we say sex, we're talking about anatomy, of course. We're talking about genitalia. We talk about hormones, like things like testosterone and estrogen. And we talk about physiology, right? Things like how our bodies are used, right? For sex, for instance, or for nursing, right? So there's of course different kinds of anatomical and physiological differences that we can clearly identify between male and female. And that's usually, of course, what they mean. When we refer to sex, we really mean the difference between male and female. Gender, on the other hand, at least, again, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, they claimed that gender was an achieved status. And that's going to be an important word, and I'll explain what that means. Here, they say that it is a constructed status through psychological, cultural, and social means. And what they mean by that is that in order to achieve a specific gender, a specific status of gender, you had to think about, it was constructed from your psychology, right? Meaning your thoughts, your emotions. It was constructed by the culture in which you found yourself, meaning if you come from, for instance, a Mexican family, an American family, a French family, whether you were poor or wealthy, whether you're educated or not. And of course, social means, meaning, again, the kind of circles you ran into, your religion, your regular sort of communities that you constantly interacted with. So all of these three areas essentially led to how you were achieving a specific gender status. But of course, they say, well, this is actually all completely wrong, for a couple of reasons, right? One of the, and I'm looking at my notes right now, but one of the things that arguments that they later focus on is that if gender is achieved, and when we think about achievement, it means that you're sort of reaching for it, like I finally achieved it. Then at some point you didn't achieve it, right? You hadn't quite achieved a gender status yet. So when they had to explain that, how do we explain, things like divisions of labor, right? When we say, well, men are going to do this, women are going to do this, males are going to do this, females are going to do this. How do we explain divisions of labor? How do we explain that, by you can only become a male or a true man, let's say it that way. You can become a man when you do X things. But if we already have a binary system in place where you are going to do one or the other, then it's not a matter. You don't have a choice of which gender you achieve. You are going to do those roles. So that's one problem. How do you explain, of course, on top of that, the formation of gender identities? Meaning, we've created essentially two genders at the time, man and woman. If we formed those genders, how can we not form other ones? And if you have to achieve something, well, you have to achieve one of those two things. You can never achieve anything else. And of course, how do you explain things like social subordination, right? Particularly when women are subordinated by men. If gender is achieved, then there's not sort of this, upward movement. We think of achievement as upward or forward movement, but subordination is a backward or downward movement. So how do you explain that to, for instance, a woman who, in order to achieve a gender status, she must first be subordinated? Again, doesn't make sense, and it's really hard to explain sociologically. And of course, there are several, theories that suggested that by age 5, gender was already fixed, just like sex. So based on some of the theories that were going on about how to explain gender and so on, it seemed that over and over again we seemed to run into this problem that it was fixed, unvarying, and static. Meaning, depending on your sex, you're automatically going to go into a specific gender. So by the time you're 5 years old, we already identified your gender. But that seems, again, awkward. Because then how do you explain when someone who we think belongs to a certain gender has achieved, right, a certain gender, what if they do something different, odd, that doesn't fit into their gender class? Do they have to re-achieve gender? Do they continue to maintain that gender status? And certain theories couldn't account for that. So eventually, by 1975, and of course they talk about that a little bit more here, we started thinking a little differently about how gender is created. So the original argument, it goes something like this, and let me see if I can open up a Word document so I can show you what I mean. The original argument was that there are two ways we can conceive of gender. One way is by looking at biology, right? We say, well, biology eventually, leads to sex, right? For instance, let's make that claim very clear, right? Biology leads to sex, and so based on our biology, we can determine whether you're male or female. But more specifically, once we know what sex is, sex leads to, for instance, culture and cultural norms. So, for instance, in the case of what it means to be a mother, for instance, let's think about what mother means. In order to be a mother, you had to have given birth, and birth is a biological thing, right? So let's imagine that, right? Birth, which is biological, leads to motherhood. Therefore, motherhood is also biological. So I hope you follow me so far. But more importantly, motherhood comes with specific roles that you're supposed to do, right? Motherhood has roles that need to be fulfilled, essentially, right? To be a mother, you need to be nurturing, you need to be caring, you have to provide for your child, and so on and so forth, which are not biological things. Nothing in our biology suggests that you have to raise children, just that you have to feed them, right? That's all. But the protective nature, well, that's different. That's not biological. That must be, as we are going to point out right now, that must be cultural, right? Lots of people looked at women. We looked at their biology. We know that they need to nurse and protect, or not necessarily protect, nurse and raise or give birth to children. We assign then roles based on that biological stuff. Well, if they can nurse children, it must mean that there must be some sort of giving or nurturing aspect of motherhood that becomes cultural. And that was the argument for a long time. But in 1975, we eventually said, nope, that's not true at all. None of this actually is true. Instead, it's actually a little bit different, and we're going to look at that right now. The argument is instead that biology and culture are reflexive and recursive. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, in other words, reflexive means it goes back. So if you can imagine there a line going from biology and culture, imagine that rather than being linear, because this is all linear right here, right? Biology leads to sex. It goes one way. It's a one-way street. Being recursive and reflexive means it goes back and forth, constantly bouncing off each other so that one affects the other. So think of it this way. Rather than thinking that a mother is simply cultural, we also think, obviously, motherhood comes from biology. So rather than saying, let me write this down here so it makes more sense. Let's say biology does lead to motherhood, right? Because of birth, for instance, right? But then we must also say that motherhood leads to culture because of things like nurturing, or nurture, I suppose. Okay, and goes in the circle, because if it's nurturing, then we have to say, well, how do we, give practices to women, biological practices to women, things like breastfeeding, right? So we go into things like motherhood necessitates or requires feeding, which is, again, biological, which then, of course, to motherhood roles, which again is cultural, and so on and so forth, and it goes into a circle, essentially. So rather than thinking of it as being linear, one affects the other directly, we say, well, no, it goes sort of full circle over and over again, so that it constantly reinvents this idea of what it means to be a mother. And so there we create a gender role. But even gender role is a problem here. And I'm going to go back to the article real quick to point out, and let me see if I can track my notes. They mention on this page right here, in this paragraph, they say, our purpose in this article is to propose an ethno-methodologically informed and therefore distinctively sociological understanding of gender as a routine, methodical, and recurring accomplishment. Notice that they no longer use the word achievement, right? Because achievement means once you've achieved it, that's it. You've done. You're finished. Just like, I achieved my degree, or I achieved a certain milestone in my life. right? Once those things are achieved, they can't be taken away. It was already achieved. But gender doesn't work that way. So that's why they call it an accomplishment. It's like you've done it, but you have to constantly, and this is what the other important word they use, that it's recurring. It happens over and over again. You have to constantly accomplish your gender in several ways. And they say that it's routine, meaning it's normal or part of your everyday life. And it's methodical, meaning that there's a specific way you have to do it. Because if you don't do it correctly, everyone else will notice, right? And they argue, say that we contend that the doing of gender is undertaken by both women and men whose competence as members of society is hostage to its production, meaning the only way we can understand people as women and men is because they constantly have to accomplish gender. They have to constantly do gender. If they don't, they are no longer members of society, right? They're no longer competent members of society. We consider them outcasts or different. So doing gender involves a complex of socially guided, perceptual, interactional, and micro-political activities that cast particular pursuits as expressions of masculine and feminine natures. I want to pay particular attention to these three words: perceptual, interactional, and micro-political. Now, they seem like really big words, but categorically they're different. So perceptual comes from within ourselves, right? And I want to write that over here back into the Word document that we've created. When we think of, again, what it means to be perceptual, we are really talking about the self. Let me see if I can zoom in on this so you can see this better. Okay. When I talk about perceptual, we're talking about the self. When we talk about interactional, well, we're not interacting with ourselves. We're interacting with another. Or, in this case, just other. Okay. And when we're being micro-political, means making decisions on a small scale, we do so under the influence of them, whoever them is. And in this case, what we mean by them is society as a whole, right? We can't see society, but we know it's there, and we know it exists. So the key here that and they make this argument throughout the paper, and of course I'm not going to go through the whole paper with you. I still insist that you read through it carefully. They're going to constantly highlight these three differences. And one of the arguments they also make is that these things are independent of each other, right? We need to analyze these three things individually, right? First, we look at how do we by ourselves construct gender and sex? How do we, with others, create gender and interact with each other that inform our sex? And finally, how does our perception of them, all the others, society, for instance, this absent but always present, being, tell us how we should act as a gender? And of course, they're gonna make or use some other words here. One of the things they come up with is sex category, and gender. Okay, and so they highlight these three differences very specifically, and they do so on page 127. Let me go back to that real quick. On page 127, right here, in this paragraph, they talk exactly about what they mean by again, sex category, and gender. So I'm going to go through each one of these. So that way, when you read the rest of the paper, you'll have an idea of what these words mean and how they're using them. And more specifically, the example of the transsexual that they end up using is going to make a lot more sense, because they're going to be able to look at these parts individually based on her, because she eventually chooses to be her, experience. So here they say sex is a determination made through the application of socially agreed upon biological criteria for classifying persons as males or females or males. Meaning that we all agree that if you have certain biological parts, you must therefore be male or female, right? If you have a penis, you are probably male. If you have a vagina and breasts, then you are female. If you have certain bone structures, if you have certain hormones, for instance, right? Uh, like you produce more estrogen than you do testosterone. Again, more indicative that you're female than male. If you are born with certain genitalia or some sort of chromosomal typing, then you're given, again, that label. So that's sex, and we've already been clear about that. We know that that's what sex is, right? When we go to the doctors and we put male or female, it's because of those parts. But here's the thing, and this is a really funny idea. When we go about all our everyday lives, how do we know what other people's sex is? I mean, it's not like we go down the street and say, that guy's clearly a male, right? How can you identify me as male if you've never seen those parts, right? If you go see someone down the street, how confident can you be that they are male or female? And most of us are quick to claim, well, like, what about facial hair? What about clearly cleavage and breasts? Like, well, that can actually all be faked. A lot of that can be faked. Um, and now with the advent of surgery and other sorts of cosmetic changes, there are easy ways of changing that sex. And short of even assuming we didn't have those kinds of advances in surgery, I mean, you still could not determine everyone's sex unless, of course, you looked under the hood, right? Uh, but you don't regularly go up to someone and say, "I would like you to pull down your pants so that we can determine what sex you are." We don't do that. So instead, we have to rely on something called sex categories, and that's the argument they make here, right? In everyday life, categorization is established and sustained by the socially required identification displays that proclaim one's membership in one or the other category. Meaning that we have to, because we aren't naked all the time and we can't display our sex regularly, we have created other ways of identifying our sex, namely through clothing, through appearance, like facial appearance and grooming, style, and so on. We've created other markers that are indicative of sex. Not that they have to be, but again, these are socially required, right? Socially required displays of our identification, right? It's very strange. As humans, we require other humans to clearly identify for us what sex they are. And in fact, as mentioned in the article later, there's an example of someone who goes to the grocery store and couldn't identify a person clearly. It was tough to determine whether they were male or female just because they could not tell. And it bothers this person that they couldn't tell. And that's, again, an example of when sex category isn't clearly defined. So then there's this gap between sex and gender. And finally, of course, they finally highlight gender and they say this is different from sex category, is the activity of managing situated conduct in light of normative conceptions of attitudes and activities appropriate for one sex category. Now that's a long term, but essentially what's being said is that yes, you have to look a certain way, right? Sex category has to do with displays, right? It has to do with how we look to make sure that we clearly belong to one sex or not. But gender is how we try to conduct ourselves. It's our behaviors, our attitudes, the activities that we do so that we clearly show that we belong to one category. Right? And that's, again, what they mean by doing gender. And of course, later on, they have this discussion about why this is so important that we make this distinction. What does this mean theoretically? What does this mean for people when we go about our day and routine? And of course, it's going to come back to this idea. I'm going to skip around. These three terms will become much more important because we're going to look at sex in the self. We're going to look at sex in interactional situations, and we're going to look at sex in micropolitical, and we'll do the same for sex category and do the same for gender. And so they do. That's essentially what their title article does, is that they look at these three terms and how they operate on these three levels. So I want you to pay particular attention to that as you read the article. And of course, you'll have a discussion board that's due tomorrow night, and you'll have until Saturday to do responses. But there's really just one question. And I'd say here, West and Zimmerman provide the following definition on page 137. Doing gender means creating differences between girls and boys and women and men. Differences that are not natural, essential, or biological. Once the differences have been constructed, they are used to reinforce the essentialness of gender. And I want you to defend, meaning you agree with it and you want to prove that you agree or why you agree with it and so on, or you refute it, meaning you disagree with it and you're going to give me examples or reasons why. Okay, so I want you to defend or refute this definition they're providing. Now notice, they're talking about gender. In fact, their entire title is called Doing Gender, which means even though they're talking about these two things, these two other terms, they're trying to classify how these two terms are different, how they contrast with gender. And so you might have an idea of what gender means, but they have a very different definition. So if you don't agree with that definition, it is your opportunity here to ask yourself why not, and of course ask your fellow peers why not. Okay, that is all for this lecture. I hope you enjoy it, and if you have more questions, of course I'm available. Starting next week, we'll have spring break, but I will have a folder available for our next big assignment. The next big assignment is the prospectus. It is the research proposal, because we're going to start picking topics, and I'll have a list of topics that you can pick. That will be ready tonight, or not tomorrow. Sorry, not tonight. Tomorrow night, Wednesday night. You will have the access to that folder, and there will be two parts to the research prospectus. Okay, the first part's very easy, which is why you won't have too much time. I'm going to open the folder up tomorrow, which means it'll give you 2 weeks. It'll be due 2 weeks later. It'll be due the Wednesday after we come back from spring break. So I'm giving you 2 weeks to do the first part, and then another week and a half or 2 weeks for the second part. But I think that should be plenty of time. And again, I'll give more specific instructions as we approach spring break, and of course when we come back from spring break. All right, take it easy.